Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our webinar on Substance ID and the BPR. The webinar presentation will take about 20 to 25 minutes. As Connie had mentioned, we will follow that by a Q&A session, so hopefully you'll be able to contribute some questions and answers to us throughout or any time during the webinar. We will be sending you a copy of the recording and the slides in a few days' time, so that's your Christmas present, so well done. So without much further ado, I'd like to introduce the two speakers as myself, Lewis Wyness, a Commercial Director at TSG. I've been working in regulatory affairs for about 30 years, and my good colleague, Stephen Buchanan. Stephen joined TSG as a senior chemistry and reach consultant, but before that, since 2008, he worked as a scientific officer in the Substance Identity and Data Sharing Unit at ECA, where he was involved in substance identity-related aspects of all significant REACH and CLP processes. He'd also worked at the Health and Safety Executive in the UK, has a degree in chemistry and industrial chemistry, so well qualified to be our speaker today. Before we go on, I would like you to indulge me. I have 3 slides on TSG. And for those not familiar with us, TSG has been providing companies around the world with regulatory guidance and scientific support for almost 30 years. Our company serves a number of key markets and industrial sectors, including agricultural, industrial, consumer, food and beverage, animal health, and medical. Our teams have scientists and regulatory experts, many of whom actually have held positions at agencies, scientific institutions, and in industry. And I think, and we think, this combination of science and knowledge from institutions and industry provides our clients with superior and well-rounded guidance. The science group, of which we are part, is listed in the London AIM Stock Exchange. The TSG in Europe has offices in Germany, France, and Spain, the UK, where we do not only scientific support for larger projects, but also day-to-day approvals, authorizations, registrations of biocidal products, as well as plant protection products and other work. So we do cover all of the European Union from these 3 hubs. And in the US, we have an office in Washington, D.C., mostly for federal matters, office in Sacramento in California, mostly for state matters, and an office in Ottawa, Ontario, in Canada. So thank you very much for that, and without much further ado, I pass over to Steve, and I'll talk to you again at the end for the Q&A session. Stephen.
Thank you, Lewis. Good afternoon, everybody. So Lewis has introduced me. I don't need to do that again. I think as a first slide, I can present the agenda so you get an idea of what we will talk about today. Substance ID and BPR, quite a broad scope, so I try and give you some granularity. I think the first slide that we will go into is the substance identification and the importance of getting it right. Then we'll look at the more legalistic aspects of substance identification in relation to the BPR, so the substance definition and the ECHA guidance. And actually we go back from BPR to REACH, where we look at the learnings from REACH in terms of substance identification, in particular the consequences of incorrect substance identification, and how substance identification processes were improved under REACH as a result of these learnings. And importantly, as this is in a BPR context, how those REACH learnings impact the BPR and substance identification under the BPR. And then more broadly, the importance of consistency of approach between not only the BPR and REACH, but also the CLP regulation. And I'll talk a little bit about the situation when you have 2 compositions and when are they similar enough to be considered the same substance or too far away that they are not. A final slide on the topical matter is really how do you get your substance identification right. We have some tips there. and then the key takeaways. So substance identification, the importance of getting it right. Why consider substance identification at the forefront of your mind when creating a regulatory submission, such as a BPR dossier? Well, ultimately, it's really defining the scope and the basis for that dossier. All BPR dossiers are connected to a single substance identity, so the dossier should refer to a single substance. And the substance identity connects to the hazard data. It helps to establish the appropriateness of that hazard data, and in particular, it helps the regulator when he's assessing that hazard data that is relevant for a single substance. And substance identity is a way to communicate hazards. So if you think of the Annex 6 of the CLP regulation, the Harmonized Classification and Labelling, all those hazards are ultimately connected back to a substance identity. And you need to kind of understand what that substance identity means to consider whether it is appropriate for your particular substance. And substance identification is really about deciding when you have two substances with similar compositions, whether they are actually the same or they are not. And rules are available to help establish that. And importantly, it facilitates data sharing. A key principle of modern EU chemical regulation is the idea to reduce the level of animal testing. So it's important that we don't create too many substance definitions that proliferate the level of animal testing. Now we move into the legal part, I would say, so the substance definition. So here we will look at the biocidal products regulation and how it connects with REACH. So the biocidal products regulation has a deference to REACH in respect of the substance definition. So this Article 3.2 actually is referring to the Article 3.1 of REACH, and there you have the substance definition. I won't read it out for you, but the point this slide is making that BPR and REACH share the same substance definition, and hopefully it will become clear why I'm emphasizing this point later on. So we also have the ECHA guidance on substance identification. So there are data requirements within both BPR and REACH in relation to substance identification. But of course, there is the need to expand on that, and that's what the official ECHA guidance does. We would actually, with a BPR dossier, we would firstly look at the guidance on BPR, and in particular, the guidance on physiochemical properties and analytical methodology. It is in that guidance where substance identification is referenced. But yet again, it's deferring back to REACH and CLP, primarily because the substance definition is the same and the data requirements for substance identification in the two regulations are similar enough to allow for one guidance document to address substance identification. So actually in the BPR, the primary guidance for substance identification is not the guidance on BPR, it's actually the ECHA guidance for identification and naming of substances under CLP, even if it's not specifically referred to in the title. And actually, what this presentation will highlight in the later slides, and I mentioned it in the agenda, is the kind of REACH experience and in respect of substance ID. And actually, ECHA has developed a lot of sector-specific support for substance identification. I think it's important to note that this isn't official guidance. It is published on the ECHA website. It's actually complementary to the official guidance, and it's just trying to establish a consistent approach to identifying substances for particular chemical sectors. And this guidance, even though it talks very much about REACH, you will, I'm sure, appreciate that it could be very relevant for biocidal active substances. And this is a screen grab from the ECHA website, and I in particular highlight the essential oils. I think this is the type of active substance that we see in biocides, also the oleochemicals. So when you're thinking of identifying substances like this under the BPR, you should consider whether these guidance documents would be useful for that purpose. So we go back to REACH, and I think it's not important if you're not involved in REACH or you don't understand REACH so well. Hopefully it becomes clear in the next bullets. But REACH was an interesting piece of legislation when it came about. It covered a vast range of substances which in some way were not captured by other chemicals legislation. And it had some ambitious goals, and one of the issues, or the discovered issues, was that substance identification was kind of underestimated as an important part early on. So there was a lot of focus on data gathering, human health data, environmental data, and the substance ID was in some way considered a given. This was actually acknowledged by ECHA, and I think the industry appreciates this. It was more challenging than what they envisaged as time went on from the start of REACH in 2008. I think some of the issues I'll try and highlight here from my own perspective. So there was an over-reliance on historic identifiers. So things that have been created under old chemical legislation, like the Dangerous Substances Directive, the INEX list, and often these identifiers were not appropriate for modern chemical legislation like REACH and BPR. And actually there was a kind of practice, I think, where substance identification was kind of assumed rather than assessed. So if a company had named a substance or identified a substance a certain way for 50 years, it kind of carried through to REACH and biocides without really being checked. And in many cases it was probably fine, but in other cases it was not. So the consequence here was that companies would find that the substance they thought they had actually was not what they had. And I give a particular mention here to the UVCB substance. I don't have the time to talk in detail too much, but UVCB substances of unknown or variable composition, complex reaction products, or biological materials, you can maybe see from the acronym I just explained how they would present a significant challenge. So to a large extent unknown, very complex, variable composition, how to identify these things when you maybe don't know a huge amount about them. And these substances exist in biocides. So special attention needed for the UVCB substances. So the learnings from REACH. The importance of substance So the final bullet I wanted to mention was that actually, in the end, ECHA and industry were not always aligned in their thinking in terms of substance identification. Not that one was right and one was wrong, they just had different perspectives on the importance of it. And what were the consequences of indirect substance identification? Here we're looking at REACH specifically, but you may be able to see links to the BPR. So significant ECHA intervention was required when substance identity was incorrect. As you may or may not know, that REACH encourages the registration jointly of substances. So you had many companies kind of under one umbrella substance ID. And of course, if one or two or many of those companies discovered that they had the wrong identifier, or ECHA discovered this for them, there was a need to somehow move them to different registrations. So this splitting and merging of these joint registrations. Then I mentioned in the earlier slide about inappropriate identifiers. These exist, and there's a need for ECHA to adapt these identifiers where companies have used them to give a more precise definition to the substance identity. And what this results in, I think in the next 5 bullets, I think this may hopefully be obvious to you, is that a number of things begin to break down and the costs and the activity starts to increase. So you have agreements that were based on a specific substance identity having to be redefined. Letters of access no longer appropriate, data sharing agreements no longer legally sound, and yet you still have to do the work to fill the data gaps for your new substance identity. And this can mean new testing, which introduces significant and unexpected costs, but also, again, challenging this principle of the reduction of animal testing. And, of course, there's supply chain consequences as a result of new identifiers. You know, labels have been produced, customers are familiar with EC and CAS numbers. So hopefully this highlights that, you know, getting the substance identity wrong at any point and it's found out later on, it's a big impact for your business. But with this knowledge, ECHA and the industry and interested parties went about improving the substance identification process under REACH. So there was a greater level of collaboration where ECHA and industry make attempts to align more as a result of this collaboration, emphasized by the sector-specific guidance documents that I would advise you or suggest you take a look. I mean, they're very useful. They raised this profile of substance identification, so through various activities such as workshops, newsletter articles, meetings with industry trade bodies, and they had an early intervention process in the compliance check stage of REACH evaluation. So this is where, before tackling the assessment of the hazard data in the REACH dossiers, they would ensure that the substance identity was correct and sound. And to do this, they had to focus separately on this and would not work on the other parts of the dossier until this was basically accurate. And to do this, they introduced a kind of informal procedure where they would work with the registrant to clean this up. So we talked a lot about REACH, and of course I can imagine many of the audience came with the BPR in mind, and now we do move to what does this mean for the BPR. I said when I highlighted the substance definition slide, there was a reason for this, and it was basically to highlight that REACH, CLP, BPR, they share this definition. They share the guidance. And so to a certain extent, you could envisage that the problems that have been seen in the REACH, the learnings, if you like, are going to be extrapolated to the BPR and also to CLP. But, you know, we must acknowledge, I don't want to, you know, give it just a general impression that everything that happens under REACH, you know, you're going to see surface to the same extent under BPR. Need to acknowledge that REACH, CLP and BPR, they have similarities, but they are different regulations and they have different processes. The scale is different when we think of the number of companies and the number of substances and the volumes. The regulated industry is different. You know, maybe smaller companies in the BPR, bigger industry in the REACH. And the way it's administered, not necessarily completely aligned. Different parts of ECHA deal with the different regulations, understandably. And there's, as you will know, if you're deeply involved in the BPR, there's a heavy level of member state involvement. In the BPR, it's maybe a bit less so in REACH, at least in the areas of substance identification, for example. So why is it important to have this consistent approach between BPR, REACH and CLP? I mean, the slides are probably highlighting many of the reasons. We'll try and consolidate them in this slide. But I think there's an important point that you should be aware of, that biocidal active substances are considered registered under REACH. So as well as many connections about the substance definition, the guidance, actually a biocidal active substance is a registered substance under REACH, an approved biocidal active substance. And of course, you know, you can have a biocidal active substance, but that same chemical entity can be a general chemical. So depending on the use, it could just be, a company could just register under REACH, or he may just have it approved under the biocidal products regulation. And we've not really talked about CLP. We won't talk about too much. This is the classification, labeling and packaging regulation, but it addresses substances, and in some way it doesn't care whether they're regulated by REACH or the BPR. And the principles of hazard assessment and data sharing In both REACH and BPR, they're generally the same. So consistency of approach is logical. I want to try and highlight, not by way of specific example, but this issue of when you have two compositions, how do you decide whether they are the same or not? That means, how do you decide whether they have the same substance identifier, such as the name, EC number, CAS number? Well, it's not easy because actually there's no precise definition for substance sameness. So if you had, say, for example, 80% benzoic acid and you have 99% benzoic acid, are they the same? In that case, if you follow the rules for regulatory purposes, broadly they are the same. At least under REACH and BPR, they would be considered the same substance. One is just a purer form, one is more impure. And it's about balancing unnecessary animal testing and correct hazard assessment. What do I mean by that? So, two compositions that have been identified with the same name identifier are considered the same. In this case, we have to rely on the assumption that a common set of rules has been followed to establish this. In the case of well-defined substances, this would be often a straightforward task. Actually, if you look at the ECHA guidance on substance ID, you'll see some actually numerical values to establish where the cutoffs are, where the boundaries. So typically, it's known as this 80-10 rule. So if two compositions have a single molecule above 10% produced by, say, different companies, above 80%, sorry, produced by different companies, they would typically be considered the same, even if impurity profile, etc., is different. But as I mentioned in earlier slides, for UVCBs, it's much more complex. Because in some cases, because of the complexity of the composition, you can have maybe two compositions that are similar, but may have been identified differently. An example of this would be an oleochemical. So you could have an oleochemical that comes from coconut oil and one that comes from palm oil. Compositionally, in terms of the chemical entities in those substances, you're looking at the same composition. But one company could identify their substance, including the origin or the source, so coconut oil versus palm oil. And because they would have a different name, and this would probably be connected to a different CAS number, in regulatory terms, they're different, even though behind that name, the composition is actually the same. And therefore, we can extend that to say the hazard would be the same, and therefore there is an opportunity to share data. But of course, this may not happen if the substance has been identified differently. So I come to the second to last slide now, and it's really some tips about getting your substance identity right. Some just general tips from my experience, I would suggest to you from my learnings under REACH. So reviewing the identity of your substance as soon as possible, I think that's always worth doing. I mean, in any regulatory submission, I think, things change, so it's always good to look back at things, and particularly the substance identity, and ensure the rules of the guidance have been considered. Like I mentioned in the earlier slide, sometimes the substance identity has been assumed to be correct, but maybe it's worth to check whether you're following the up-to-date ECHA guidance on substance identity. Other companies are always a good source, particularly if you're working with them, to decide whether your substance identity is correct and you do indeed have the same substance as them. Now, the same substance equals same substance identity. And if you do discuss, always good to document, record discussions and any agreements you make. And of course, there's trade associations, industry bodies, as you remember, they can be very helpful, and they've been quite involved in helping ECHA generate this sector-specific guidance. And then, of course, there is the regulator, not so much in a formal sense, but there are processes which can help you decide on whether your substance identity is correct or not. So, for example, the inquiry process, this is the if you like, approval process to see if there's any other applicants out there with the same substance. Chemical similarity check, a voluntary check by ECHA with a cost associated, and technical equivalence if you want to be an alternative source for an already approved active substance. And of course, ECHA will make assessments of your substance identity information and it will provide you with the correct substance identity. So we come to the last slide, which is just 4 key takeaways. Correct substance identification is a critical part of any regulatory submission in terms of chemicals. In building your submission, review your substance identity. Ideally, is the first thing you do, or as early as possible. And if already the submission has been made, look back over it and ensure it's correct. Get support, particularly in the case of UVCB substances. This is a huge universe of substances, if you like. Some UVCB substances reasonably well defined, the chemistry not that complex, to some UVCB substances where you know very little of what's in there. And that makes things like hazard assessment quite challenging. And finally, ensure that you are up to date with relevant industry sector developments and also regulatory changes. REACH, BPR, CLP, they're actually quite fast-moving pieces of legislation. They don't seem to stand still for very long, so always keep abreast of that. And on that note, I thank you for listening, and I will pass back to Lewis.
Thank you very much, Stephen. I have heard that presentation before, as you can imagine, but it does always interest me that the significance of substance IB in many regulated sectors is often underestimated. And it was nice to get some practical guidance from your experience there. It's often difficult, I think, to give too many specific examples in this type of presentation because they are so specific. However, we've got some questions from those of you that are listening, and thank you for that. And I'll ask you the first question. Stephen, I haven't seen these questions, just so you know, we haven't set it up beforehand. So, Stephen, the first question is, when a substance is approved by a BPC committee, does it have to also be registered or renewed under the REACH regulation?
No, generally, I mean, when you have an approved active substance, I forget the specific article on the REACH, maybe it's around about Article 24. It actually states not only biocidal substances, but also pesticidal substances regulated under plant protection products regulation are considered registered under REACH. So there's nothing more you have to do. It's like an accepted thing that happens after approval under the BPR.
Okay, thank you. So UVCB substances are, of course, infinitely interesting for those that you have them and not for those that don't. But the question is here, how do you identify these substances accurately if by their nature so little is known about them?
So it's really dependent on the UVCB. I think I touched on it in the last slide that there's a whole universe of UVCB substances. Some of them, the composition is very well known. So you can manage to identify substances based on their composition, almost close to well-defined substances. But if there is very little known, it's an accepted practice also presented in the ECHA guidance that you can identify your substance using proxies. So, for example, the source material and the key aspects of a process, for example. So actually you're not describing really the chemical entities, but really the starting materials in the process.
Okay, thank you. Another question that you had talked about reviewing substance identities for existing substances and new substances, but won't ECHA do that for us eventually?
Yes, I mean, I mean, I talked about some of these processes like you could utilise, and legally you may have to utilise them, like inquiry, technical equivalence. ECHA, of course, will make an assessment. I think the important thing is here that the same issues would still apply, because ECHA is in some of these processes like inquiry, it will be making an assessment up front, but you may have already got into agreements with companies, and if, for example, you're part of the review programme where the substance ID has not been assessed in great detail, then ECHA will indeed evaluate this at a certain point down the line, but often, you know, things are already in place, tests have been done, etc. So it's true that they will, you know, involve themselves in this process, but it's actually when they do it is probably the issue.
Okay, thank you. Of course, we can't get through many Brexit webinars without mentioning the dreaded Brexit, so I said it too early there. Question is, if substance identity is the preserve of ECHA, as you suggest, how will the UK deal with that after Brexit? So I mean, MSCAs, that's the member states, are already involved in the BPR process to quite a significant extent. I would say much more than they are under REACH. And I mean, I can say, as Lewis introduced me, I worked for the HSE before I came to ECHA, and you know, they have very good experience of the chemistry aspects of chemical legislation, and including substance ID. So I would not envisage any issues there. I think it will be a smooth transition, and probably very similar practices that you see coming out of ECHA will come out of the HSE after Brexit. Okay, thank you. One last question. Perfect timing. You mentioned historic identifiers as not being appropriate, but for many biocides, we rely on CAS numbers that have not changed for many years, and that would cause significant problems if they were to change for what might be seen as dogmatic reasons or bureaucratic reasons. Yeah, and this is, I guess, one of the key issues of substance identification and historical identification, where companies have relied on, I think, primarily CAS number for many years, and the impact of changing this it can be big, because CAS numbers in particular are used by the US for their regulatory inventories. ECHA, and I would imagine all regulators will assess the consequences of changing the substance ID. So if the historic identifier maybe doesn't fit well to the current guiding rules, but describes the substance in an appropriate way, I would envisage it would be unlikely to be changed, provided it's well understood what is behind this, and all industry who have that substance are using that identifier consistently. So I would be surprised if you know, for dogmatic reasons, a chaos was caused in the supply chain. I think, you know, there will be some pragmatic considerations there. Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Stephen. And thank you, listeners, for sending in the questions. Don't forget, we will send you a recording and the presentation. And it remains for me to thank you for listening. And from all of us at TSG Consulting, we wish you a very happy holiday season. Thank you. Goodbye.